Howdy my totally, as always, Tubular Gamers. We're back with, you guessed it, another video. Thanks for coming back to the channel. If you're new here, maybe stick around for a while. I got a fun ranking video for you. Today we're going to be talking about the Borderlands games. Yes, the RPG FPS hybrid series with the cell shading that people absolutely love. We're finally talking some Borderlands. Created by Gearbox Software and published by 2K, the Borderlands series has gone on to be one of the most popular action RPG series of the 2010s and now 2020s. There are several games in the franchise now, and for today's video I thought I'd rank them all worst to best, give each one of them a little review, stacking them up against each other, seeing which ones are worth playing, which ones aren't worth playing, and which ones are the most cringe. We're going to be ranking these games based off quality, how's the gameplay, how's the loot, how's the story and writing, do you actually even give a shit about these characters? We're looking at pretty much everything here. I've been a huge fan of the Borderlands series for over a decade now, and I'm really excited to talk about the games today. As always, I'm not going to be talking about the mobile games. I just don't have any experience with those, and I doubt many, if any of you, care about them. I certainly don't. But enough dilly-dallying around, let's get to it. Let's get to the ranking. As always, please like, share, comment, subscribe. I got the Patreon and the super thanks. Any support is truly greatly appreciated. Seriously, thank you so much. This list was requested by a patron, so thank you again for the support. I really do appreciate you, and I hope everyone who's made it to this part of the video is doing well. Alright, enough of that, let's get into it. What's the worst of the Borderlands games? Well, it probably shouldn't come as a surprise that I think the weakest of the Borderlands games is New Tales from the Borderlands, releasing in 2022. I guess they took the new Super Mario Bros. Approach to Borderlands, huh?
To shut the fuck up!
Okay, so this game isn't really a sequel to Tales from the Borderlands, it's more of a sequel to Borderlands 3, and it was not developed by Telltale since they had already been shut down by this point. It was developed directly by Gearbox, and ooh, you can just tell this game was developed by Gearbox from the writing to the tone to the general atmosphere. It feels very in line with the mainline Borderlands games, as opposed to Tales from the Borderlands, which felt like a unique spin on the Borderlands formula. Here, yeah, it feels much more like Borderlands 3 when it comes to the humor, the writing, the characters, and again, just the entire tone of this game. So like the first Tales from the Borderlands, this is an episodic graphic adventure game that is very focused on its narrative, world building, and characters. There is gameplay here, but it is very basic. Like, I wouldn't even say this is an adventure game. You get to walk around in a few areas, there's some quick time events that you need to complete, and there's plenty of narrative choices, but there's no like complex puzzles. You don't pick up items and use them somewhere else. Some of the characters have their own unique gadgets, but it's very situational and it really has more to do with the story than anything else. Most of the game you are watching things unfold rather than, you know, intense gameplay, which, fair enough, that's what the first Tales from the Borderlands had. I'm not going to act like this gameplay is revolutionary, innovative, or some kind of new idea, but it gets the job done for what it is. And honestly, the gameplay is what I have the least amount of issues with. When it comes to the story, it's these three new protagonists coming together to, quote, save the world, and that is Anu, Octavio, and Fran. And I'll just say these characters are no Reese or Fiona. The main characters in this game are just, well, they're just not very good. Actually, in my opinion, it extends a bit further than that. The characters' writing, story, world building, and general sense of humor are just not very good. Now, when it comes to narrative-based video games, I'm really not all that particular. I'm not looking for the next Mass Effect or Uncharted or Last of Us. It doesn't have to be amazing or perfect or some of the best storytelling in a video game. It just needs to be half decent, and if they're not really going to focus on the story, I expect them to focus on the gameplay. But with this being a narrative-driven adventure, it saddens me to say that I really did not like this game's narrative, characters, pacing, or jokes. I didn't think Borderlands 3 was all that great in these areas either, but this is even worse. I just did not find like any of these characters likable in the slightest. The main characters were annoying, cringy, unfunny, and I was rolling my eyes way too many times. The pacing of this game is terrible. It feels like it drags on so many times and I just wanted the chapter to end. And then I didn't think the writing was all that good either. I thought it was just aggressively unfunny. Like, for every joke that hits and gets a laugh out of me, there's like 15 to 20 jokes that don't even get a chuckle out of me. Like, I really thought the writing was just painful at times, and unfortunately in a narrative-based game, if the story isn't very good, if the characters aren't likable, and if the writing doesn't create an engaging, compelling narrative, well then what's the point? What is the point indeed with this game? Well, at least the presentation is actually pretty decent. It looks nice, the animation is good, and the voice acting, it was actually alright. Sure, the lines feel like they were written by AI a bunch of the time, and it's just super unfunny, but the actual performances were okay. You do actually get to make some choices in this game that can affect certain parts of the narrative and outcomes of decisions, but it really feels incredibly inconsequential, and I just didn't care. I didn't care about what was happening, I didn't care about the characters, and I really didn't care about my choices either, and that is the worst thing I can say for a narrative-driven game. While I can't say this game is a bag of flaming shit, I can't say it's a good game either. I didn't enjoy my time with it, I don't recommend anybody tries this one, and I'm sure there are people that like it out there, but it just wasn't for me. And all this really goes to show just how good Telltale was at creating narrative-driven games. And here we have it, the game that started it all, the original Borderlands, releasing all the way back in 2009. And I very much remember when this game came out. There wasn't a ton of hype for this one before it came out. There really wasn't any hype when it came out either. It was after that it gained just a ton of traction, and that's when I got on it as well, after hearing on the playground that, hey, this new game called Borderlands is actually pretty good. It's like Oblivion with guns, and obviously that's not totally accurate, but that's how the game was sold to me, and I went, okay, I'll go try it. And then I got it, played through it with my friends, and went, yeah, this is actually pretty good. And even 15 years later, I think the game is still a good time. Is it the best of the Borderlands series? Absolutely not. I'd say really every Borderlands game after is better outside of New Tales from. But usually that's a good thing. That means every sequel improved on the original game, and this original game really laid out the blueprint for the entire series going forward. I will say this game has a very different tone, atmosphere, setting, writing style, and vibe about it. This was before Borderlands really became super goofy or silly or had an emphasis on comedy. The game actually takes itself relatively seriously. Sure, there are a few parts that are a little funny, but for the most part, yeah, it's a serious game. The game is incredibly light on its story though. There's really not much here. You choose one of 4 characters and you're dropped onto this planet known as Pandora, looking for this mysterious vault that has all this treasure. And you get these mysterious visions, messages, instructions, I don't know what the hell they are, from this like guardian angel to go find the vault, and that's really all the story you get. Some other characters are introduced here like Claptrap, Scooter, and Tannis, but I'll be real, they aren't the most memorable. They don't have incredibly distinct personalities, and it feels like at times they're there just to give you more quests rather than being actual characters with dialogue and personality, and they aren't making jokes left and right, and it doesn't feel like every other sentence they say I could have found on a Reddit board. They, for the most part, feel like just normal characters in a game. They certainly got all their characterization really in Borderlands 2, and I could basically say the same thing for the writing. It's just kind of there. It's not terrible, it's not generic, but it's not really interesting, engaging, or all that memorable. The plot in general isn't very good. The plot of the original Borderlands has been criticized for years now, and here I am to do the same thing. It's almost non-existent, like you're told to just find the vault, and that really is the objective for the entire game. There is a little world building, but I feel like you don't learn a ton about Pandora or these factions or the characters and their backstories, and this game infamously has one of the worst endings to like any video game. Like, the ending is horrible. I thought it was awful then, and I look back now and I'm like, yeah, that ending was pretty terrible. I don't know what they were thinking, but people didn't fall in love with Borderlands for the story, the world, or the characters, which isn't awful, but isn't really anything special. People really loved Borderlands because of the gameplay. The game is an open-world FPS RPG hybrid where you're dropped onto this relatively big planet known as Pandora with tons of different biomes and regions, and really are told 2 things. You need to go do stuff for characters, and you need to shoot a lot of things, and that's the gameplay in a nutshell. You talk to characters, they give you quests. Usually you go to the quest area where you kill everything and collect something, or you just kill everything. Then you go back to the quest giver and get a new one, rinse and repeat for about 20 hours, and there you have the original Borderlands. And of course there's a bunch of other optional quests you can do, like what you get from the bounty board, but either way you're going to be shooting a lot of things. You'll be driving around in this car to get to the objectives, and then you shoot everything that moves essentially. You can play the entire game in up to 4-player co-op, and I'll just say playing this entire game in co-op really is the ideal experience. You can play through the game by yourself, but I really don't think you're going to have the best experience with this game if you're by yourself. Like, you're not going to have a bad experience, but the game really does thrive in co-op. At the beginning of the game, you get to choose one of 4 classes, and all 4 of the classes do play relatively different from each other. They all have their own unique skill tree that does set them apart. They also specialize in different weapons. You can also customize your tree and try to have, your own unique build, but it's nowhere near as extensive or customizable as, say, Borderlands 2 and on. It's relatively basic, and for the most part, the gameplay is is pretty much the same, especially at the beginning when you can barely even use your abilities. And speaking of abilities, let's talk about the combat. It is a first-person shooter. You get tons upon tons of guns. Seriously, this game was marketed as the game with the most guns, and thanks to its random generation and random loot drops that are very similar to Diablo, yeah, it has a shit ton of weapons. Like, there are so many different types of guns, it's not even funny. Submachine guns, shotguns, snipers, bazookas. You will find no shortage of guns here, and the combat is pretty decent. I will say it gets a lot better in later Borderlands games, but this original game still is decent enough combat. The weapons feel good, the enemies put up enough of a fight that it can be a challenge at times, and once you get your abilities and you can start using them more and more, it actually becomes quite a bit more fun. I'd say compared to the other Borderlands games, the combat is simplistic and basic, but I still had a good time with it. Something else Borderlands was crazy about was the loot. You get loot for completing quests, defeating hard enemies, and just finding it all about. And yeah, it is like Diablo where it's randomized loot, and I think this is one of the better implementations of randomized loot in a game. I actually think this adds to the game, and it's not super annoying like in, say, Neo or Wolong, where I just get a bunch of random shit I don't care about. They don't go crazy with the loot and legendaries like in Borderlands 3 or Tiny Tina's, but I still thought it was enjoyable. I think the loot loop, say that 3 times, is pretty enjoyable. I think the gameplay loop in general is rather enjoyable and compelling enough to the point where I would see the entire game start to finish. And I've played through this game a few times, but I do have some issues with it. The pacing of Borderlands 1, I'll just be real, is kind of terrible. The first, I'd say, half of the game is just not all that exciting. You're still building your character, you don't even have their ability yet, and the quests you get aren't very good. It's really flat level design, and I know plenty of people that gave up in the first few hours and went, man, Borderlands is so boring. And yeah, it takes a while before it gets exciting. Too long, in fact, in my opinion. That's why I really recommend playing through the game in co-op. It makes the beginning part a lot more tolerable. If you're by yourself, I could totally see why you think it's boring. It takes a while before it really gets interesting or engaging or exciting, and I really couldn't blame you. It's not like the side content's compelling in this game. The side quests are some of the most bland, generic, cookie-cutter side quests I've ever seen in a video game. Like, it's just straight up dull. And on that note, we have the presentation. Yes, the game does have the cel shading art style Borderlands is known for, but it's not as vibrant or pretty or exciting as the other games. Like, it looks okay. It actually looks pretty budget. At least the game ran nice, but it's nothing special. The music outside of Ain't No Rest for the Wicked pretty much is non-existent either, or it's just kind of bland atmospheric music. And yeah, all of this combined can lead to at times a dull experience. There is also a bunch of DLC for this game, but I've never really messed around much with this game's DLC. Overall, the original Borderlands, while it does have some flaws, there is certainly way more good than bad here. It has a lot going for it, and you could easily see the potential of this series that they would later reach. But this game is still alright, so do I recommend it? Do I think it's worth your time? Maybe. I mean, if you've played any Borderlands game that's come out after the original, this is going to feel like a step back. And so if you haven't played any of them, yes, I absolutely recommend it. But if you've played like a shit ton of Borderlands 2 and 3 and you want to try the original, see what it's all about, you might be a bit disappointed. It's not the longest game, especially if you stick to just the main quests, and it is readily available and very cheap, but I wouldn't say go out of your way to play it. It's only if, you know, you really want more and more Borderlands, or you want to see when the series was kind of serious, but it still is a good one. And here we have Borderlands the prequel, which initially came out in 2014. I very much remember when this game came out 10 years ago, and I thought it was just such a weird release. It was only on last-gen hardware. It wasn't primarily developed by Gearbox, and the name was just so weird. The prequel, so what, it's in between Borderlands 1 and 2? Yes, actually, it is in between Borderlands 1 and 2. And it really is about Handsome Jack's rise to power. He leads a group of 4 Vault Hunters to regain the space station known as Helios, and of course there's a vault and you're gonna have to find the treasure. Interesting enough, the 4 Vault Hunters are actually characters from prior Borderlands games, including Athena, Nisha, Claptrap, and Wilhelm. And I think it's a decent enough cast of characters. The story, yeah, it's alright. The writing is okay, and it feels pretty in line with Borderlands 2. It's not crazy, goofy, and silly and relying on memes all the time. It's actually still sort of serious, but still making a bunch of jokes and having a bunch of laughs. And yeah, I think the humor is actually pretty decent in this game. The game was developed primarily by 2K Australia, and I think the game has a lot of, quote, Australian humor, but I thought the game was funny enough. I think the general plot, characters, and world building, while nothing special, is still decent enough. It's certainly better than what we had in the original game, but it really did feel like a step down from Borderlands 2. especially because the antagonist is just really forgettable and not all that good. Now when it comes to the gameplay, it plays very much like Borderlands 2. I remember thinking that this felt like a standalone expansion to Borderlands 2 at times. It really plays that similar. And it's kind of funny because I played a shit ton of Borderlands 2 back when it came out, and so when I hopped onto the pre-sequel, I was like, oh, this is just inferior Borderlands 2. I'm just going to go back to Borderlands 2. And obviously I'm not that close-minded now. I can look back and see that yes, the pre-sequel, while it is not as good as Borderlands 2, it still is pretty decent gameplay. In terms of the core gameplay though, yes, it really is the same as Borderlands 1 and 2, where you're dropped into this big open area, you're not on Pandora at least, and you're basically given just a bunch of quests to go kill things, collect things, kill things some more. That really is the main gameplay hook here. As you kill more things and complete quests, you'll level up, you'll get skill points, you can customize your character. The characters actually do all play decently different from each other, and you really can customize your build. But I wouldn't say these characters are as good as Borderlands 2's characters, and I'm not talking about just from a personality standpoint, but from a gameplay standpoint as well. While the abilities are cool, I don't think they're as unique or memorable as, say, other Borderlands games. When it comes to the general combat, it really plays exactly the same as Borderlands 2. It feels exactly the same, the weapons feel the same, they added laser guns and cryogenic elements to certain weapons and items, but it really plays exactly the same as 2. So if you like 2's gunplay and combat, you're gonna like it here. And when it comes to the loot, I didn't find it as strong as 2's, but it was fine enough. The biggest additions or tweaks to the gameplay have to do with the fact that you are in space. Air is something you actually have to think about in this game, but there are O2 kits literally all over the place, so you rarely have to actually think about it, especially if you're Claptrap, who doesn't have to worry about that at all. But the kits aren't just for providing you air, you can have a little bit of fun, you can use it like a jetpack, you can double jump, you can hover, you can even do like a ground slam. And on the subject of traversal, there are some low gravity areas where you'll move slower, but you'll jump super high and loot will fly all over the place, and yeah, this is just something that happens throughout the game. They even introduced 2 new vehicles, the Moon Buggy and a hover bike. But I'm going to keep it 100 with you, Chief. These don't really add much to the gameplay, if anything. I actually found them a bit of a hindrance. I found the anti-gravity areas just kind of annoying, and having to get oxygen, yeah, this wasn't really all that fun either. I feel like these could have been implemented a lot more into the gameplay, but it really feels like they just kind of threw it in there and are like, yeah, it does something different, and I'm just like, and it kind of sucks. And it also affects the level design, which I think is pretty weak in general. I also think the side quests are some of the worst of the entire series, and that really is saying something, like where you have to get all the white weapons. I hated this shit. I just didn't care for the side content and just stopped doing it entirely by the end of the game. I also didn't love the game's pacing. Like, it's not that long of a game. It's around the same length as the first game, but kind of like the first game, it feels quite dull at the beginning, and by the end of it, I was just kind of done. And this is one of the only Borderlands games I haven't replayed. I just don't feel really any incentive to play all the way through the game again, even with the extra Vault Hunter modes. When it comes to the presentation, yeah, I mean, it's basically the same as Borderlands 2. It looks nice enough, but the music really was nothing special. Overall, I think the pre-sequel is a good game, but not a great game. It does take what was good about Borderlands 2, but it doesn't improve on it, innovate on it. It's a very iterative sequel, and sure, not every game has to reinvent the wheel for the series, but I would hope the sequel is just as good as the prior game, and yeah, it's not in my opinion. I still think it's worth playing if you love Borderlands, but I wouldn't say you should put this at the top of your must-play Borderlands games list. But at the very least, it is widely available and very cheap. And here we have Borderlands 3, which initially released in 2019. I was pretty excited for this one and was hoping it would be the next big step for the series that the pre-sequel was not. And you know, for the most part, it's a decent step forward. The story's certainly different from any of the other Borderlands games. It sees 4 new Vault Hunters being recruited by the Crimson Raiders of Pandora to stop these twins who are trying to harness the power and energy of these vaults to, I guess, take over the entire galaxy. Oh, and the twins are live streamers, which they let you know several times. Well, I think on paper the premise is decent enough, and I'm glad they're moving away from Handsome Jack and trying something new. In practice, I don't think the story is very good. I didn't find the story or world building as compelling as the second games. Actually, it's not even close to the second games, and I didn't find the characters anywhere near as interesting or likable as the second games, especially the villains. Like, I'll just go right to it. One of the reasons Borderlands 2 is as good as it is when it comes to the story and characters is because the antagonist, Handsome Jack, was so good. The twins are not that. I do not like the twins, and it's not the type of villain where I'm like, oh, you love to hate him, they're such a good antagonist. It's more like, get off the screen, I do not like you, you are annoying, you are cringe, and I'd rather look at just about any other character. and the writing really just does them no favors. They are incredibly unfunny, they're just straight up annoying, and again, they're cringe. A lot of the writing to this game is cringe. They try to make tons and tons of jokes, and most of the time, it just doesn't land. Something must have seriously changed for the writing between Borderlands 2 and 3, or Borderlands 2 really was just a fluke, because this game is not even half as funny as the second is. I really just found it kind of annoying. Like, the game isn't completely unfunny. There were a few times that made me laugh or crack a smile, but a majority of the time I was just like, ugh, this isn't funny and I really just want to move on. It kind of reminds me of like cringe Marvel movie jokes. It's to the point where there's actually mods for the PC version that just make it so none of the characters speak. And I'm not saying that's the solution, but you know, they might be onto something. Okay, clearly I'm not a fan of the lackluster story, sense of humor, characters, world, etc. Let's talk about the gameplay. When it comes to the core gameplay, it really isn't all that different from the previous few games. You're dropped into some big open environments and really are just given some quests. The quests are usually to just go get something and kill a lot of enemies, or just kill a lot of enemies. The entire game can be played cooperatively still. You still get in the car to drive around, and you still get lots and lots of guns. And when it comes to the loot, Borderlands 3 is pretty great actually. It's been kinda overhauled from Borderlands 2, and they give you a lot of good shit. You won't be grinding anywhere near as much to get those legendaries or really awesome weapons, and it's kind of a breath of fresh air. This isn't like Destiny 2 or Diablo where you gotta grind hella. No, Borderlands 3 has no problem giving you some really good shit, and you don't have to pay real world money for it either. The loot made the gameplay a lot more enjoyable. Something else that makes the gameplay enjoyable is the combat. The combat is quite a bit better than Borderlands 2. It might not look all that different, but if you go from 2 to 3, you'll immediately be able to notice that the combat really is better. The guns feel a lot better, they're a lot more satisfying, there's a lot more variety with the weapons, there's just a shit ton of weapon types. Fighting the enemies in general is more engaging, they can put up a decent enough challenge, you get a bunch of abilities, the characters actually do feel very different from each other, and you can have some really unique builds, especially on a second playthrough. Like, you can have characters that are completely different from each other, and then they've added more elements, a bunch of modifiers. The guns themselves have random modifiers. Some of them just go nuts, like guns that shoot guns, and all of this just makes the combat more enjoyable. That, and you can also crouch slide like it's Titanfall out here, not that there's really much of a use for it. I think the combat, character customization, and abilities really are better than Borderlands 2. It just feels really nice, and I think it is a more enjoyable experience. Something different from Borderlands 1 and 2 is you actually leave Pandora, you go to other planets, you go to a bunch of different areas, and I will just say, these are some really big open areas you go to. Like, way too big. My biggest issue with the gameplay is actually these maps and the general level design. These are some barren, giant open worlds you go through, and you spend just way too much time going through these. A lot of my playtime was just sitting in the car, driving to the next location. Even with all the fast travel, you'll still be just driving from location to location, and it never took this long in the other Borderlands games. Like, these felt big for the sake of being big, and the quests don't take advantage of them either. The quest structure is exactly the same as the previous couple games. Go kill X or go collect Y. There's just a lot of downtime in between now where you're just trying to get to the location, way more than the other Borderlands games, and it got kinda dull, especially by the end. I didn't want to do any of the side content because I didn't want to drive halfway across the map to go do it. Not that the side quests were all that compelling to begin with. Unfortunately, like the previous few games, they're just some of the most bland, cookie-cutter side quests you'll find in any AAA game. They are as lifeless as this open world is. At least the game looks nice. It is a good-looking game, the environments are good, the character models are solid, and the music is actually pretty decent. The voice acting's good too. I don't like the writing or the dialogue, but I'll compliment some good voice acting, so it's pretty clear I'm a bit mixed on Borderlands 3. While I think the combat, character customization, and skills are even better than Borderlands 2, I don't care for the story, I don't like the open world, and issues from prior Borderlands games carry over, like the side quests being crap and the user interface still being terrible, especially on the map. Like, the map screen is awful in this game, and it just made navigation that much more of a pain in the ass. Despite all of this, I still would recommend the game. I think it's a good game. While I don't love every aspect of the game, the core gameplay of the game is combat. A majority of the game is combat, and I think the combat is great. It feels great, the gunplay is solid, I like how many different guns and abilities there are, and when you're with 4 friends, it genuinely is a good time. But this game has a lot of other little issues that really just drag it down for me. I still think the game is worth your time, especially if you like the other Borderlands games, but it wasn't exactly what I was hoping the next Borderlands game would be. And here we have Tiny Tina's Wonderlands releasing initially in 2022. I don't know if it's a super hot take to say that I enjoyed Wonderlands more than Borderlands 3, but I always keep it 100-100 with you all. And I genuinely did enjoy this game more than Borderlands 3. So this game is kind of a sequel to Tiny Tina's Assault on Dragon Keep, which was a DLC for Borderlands 2, a fantastic DLC that eventually got its own standalone release. But when it comes to this game's story, it's pretty much the same concept, where Tina and a few friends are playing D&D, and you get to experience the adventures that they're having. Also, a bunch of nonsense and rules gets made up on the fly from Tina and all of her wacky antics. I actually like the story. I think it's pretty decent. Sure, it is relatively low stakes and it's just Tina and her friends playing D&D, but I found it incredibly entertaining. Like, sure, the humor and writing isn't all that different from Borderlands 3, but I just found this game funnier. The jokes hit more often. It wasn't super annoying and cringy. I didn't want to turn all of the characters' voices off. The antagonist is actually decent and likable and way better than whatever the twins were going for. Yeah, I think the story, the characters, and the writing, it's alright. Is it peak Borderlands? No. And I'm sure plenty of people hated the writing and humor of this game like they did for Borderlands 3, but I thought it was alright. Now, when it comes to this game's gameplay, it actually kind of moves the series forward, low-key more than even Borderlands 3 did. Instead of choosing between a few different vault hunters, you actually get to create your own character from scratch, and then you get to choose a class for them. There are 6 different classes, and all 6 are actually wildly different from each other, and at some point in the game, you get to even add a subclass, further adding to the customization. Like, you can have some really different builds in this game. You can have some incredibly varied builds, more so than even the other games. And I quite enjoyed this. I know it's because of the D&D flavor, but this level of customization, I thought it was pretty cool. The D&D flavor doesn't end there though. As you level up, you also get hero points that you can up your base stats with, on top of the usual skill points and skill trees where you can mix and match skills. When it comes to the RPG side of things, this game has got exactly what you're looking for, and I think it succeeds in that sense. Something else that's very different about this game from any other Borderlands game is the structure. This game actually features an overworld that you get to walk around on, and you very much can see the D&D inspiration here, but I actually think this is pretty cool. The overworld's not massive, and there's a bunch of little locations you can go to and characters to talk to, and of course those characters are going to give you quests, or side quests even, and you're going to go complete them for them and then bring it back to them. On the overworld, random encounters even show up, but you can actually just beat their ass and stop them from even attacking you. And on top of this, there's a bunch of secrets and treasure, and there's even a few puzzles on this overworld. I actually really like the overworld. It's a good change of pace, it's well designed, and it allows the game to stay relatively streamlined. But eventually you'll get off this overworld and you go to the towns and the dungeons, where it very much looks like, you know, any other Borderlands game, and naturally, like any other Borderlands game, you're gonna get into fights. And I think the combat is pretty good as well. It really builds off Borderlands 3, which I also thought had very good combat, and the guns feel just as good as they did in Borderlands 3, if not even better. While all the guns you would expect to see in a Borderlands game show up, there's a bunch of medieval weapons as well, and these are pretty fun to use. I wish there was more of them, honestly. You also get a dedicated melee weapon, a first for the series, and the melee combat, well, it's there. I'm not going to act like that's amazing. Your characters do have a variety of different abilities they can use depending on your classes and how you've built them. There are no more grenades, instead you get spells, which is pretty cool, but they function basically the same as grenades. Your equipment is a little different from the other Borderlands games, but the whole equipment side of things is relatively similar. But what would a Borderlands game be without loot? This game has plenty of randomized loot, and it's more like Borderlands 3 with the loot, where they just go nuts. They'll give you legendaries, they'll give you cool ass shit. You find these dice that can improve your odds of getting even better weapons, and I found the loot poop pretty engaging. In fact, I found the entire gameplay loop engaging. Sure, even with the overworld and all of these changes, it still is like, hey, I have a quest for you. You need to go kill something or collect something from me. Please go do it. And then you do it and you get some cool loot. But I feel like this game, it actually tries to mix things up a little bit, but that probably is just due to the D&D influence. It didn't get repetitive, the gameplay loop didn't get stale, and I thought the pacing was actually pretty good. Something else worth noting is that I think the maps are way better designed in this game. They're not absolutely gargantuan like Borderlands 3. Okay, like 1 or 2 of them are, but for the most part, it's not. And it doesn't take an eternity to get through them, and I think it improves the pacing of the game overall. The game isn't super long either, taking around 12 to 20 hours depending on how much side content you do, and the side content, it's actually okay. It's somewhat memorable, and it's better than the usual generic cookie cutter quests you're used to from a Borderlands game. and once you beat it, you can do New Game Plus or this new infinite dungeon known as the Chaos Chamber. There's actually a decent amount of post-game. Now, I will say, despite all these additions and changes, if you're someone who's not a fan of the Borderlands formula or the writing or style of these games, you're probably still not going to like this game. I don't think it's going to win you over, but if you're someone who even mildly enjoys the formula, I think you're going to like this one. It's not perfect. The user interface is still shit. Some of the quests aren't all that exciting. The platforming can be kind of wonky, and there are still some bugs in the game, but for the most part, I really did enjoy my time with this one. The presentation's solid, the gameplay's good, it's got a decent sense of humor, and I found it pretty entertaining for the most part. And speaking of entertaining, we have Tales from the Borderlands, developed by Telltale and released episodically from 2014 to 2015. Tales from the Borderlands was going to give us a unique, fresh perspective on the Borderlands franchise, and that's absolutely what they did. This is one of Telltale's absolute best games when they were just pumping classics out left and right, The Walking Dead, The Wolf Among Us, and Tales from the Borderlands. And it's crazy how almost 10 years later, Tales from the Borderlands is one of the best graphic adventure games you could play, and it really stomps a mud hole into that new Tales from the Borderlands game. So the game takes place after Borderlands 2, but the story revolves around two characters, this Hyperion employee named Reese and a con artist named Fiona. And the two of them, I'll just say, team up to find a vault. There's a lot more to this story than that. There's a lot of other characters, and it's not just a bunch of characters from prior Borderlands games, it's actually new characters as well. And I'll just say this cast of characters is fantastic, especially the two protagonists. They're incredibly likable and actually have a decent amount of depth. They are some of the best protagonists of any Telltale game. I also think the world and general world building is really good in this game. They present the Borderlands world in such a different light. Like, Pandora is a fucked up place that nobody wants to be at, and they absolutely show that here, and I think it's great. I love seeing Pandora in this light, and then the writing is actually really good as well. The story is constantly interesting. I couldn't predict what was going to happen. The characters have a real amount of emotion, and then the game's actually funny. The game is really funny. There's a few parts that are some of the funniest parts of the Borderlands series. I'll just say the finger gun shit, oh, it is so good. Seriously, the story's great, the writing is interesting, it's engaging, the pacing's really good, there's not a dull moment here, and you really are going to want to see what happens to our main characters. Once I started playing this game, I did not put it down. I was like, oh, I gotta see what happens next, and I ended up playing through the whole game in like 1 or 2 sittings. It's about 10 hours long, but it is so worth it and rewarding. When it comes to the gameplay, it really is the same as other Telltale games where there barely is any gameplay. You occasionally get to walk around an area, investigate some stuff, talk to characters, and then you get to make a bunch of choices. The choices, yeah, they don't matter a ton in this game, but there still are a few moments where you can actually get some different outcomes, and so it might be worth playing through the game again. I think it's worth playing through the game again just because it is so good, but just know these choices aren't like absolutely monumental to the game. I also think the presentation is very good. I mean, I like the art style. I think it's been adapted to the Telltale tool very well. The animation's solid, and the voice acting is great. The voice acting is fantastic, actually, and fantastic a great word to describe this game. If you've had any interest in the Borderlands series, I absolutely think this is worth playing. Yes, it's very different, but the story, the characters, the set pieces, the writing, it is all worth it. You will not regret your time with this one. It is so good. Sure, there might be a few bugs here and there like most Telltale games, and I know these styles of games aren't for everybody, but you really just can't go wrong with this one. I can't recommend it enough. But here we have it, initially releasing in 2012, Borderlands 2, the absolute GOAT of the Borderlands series. You already knew it was going to be number one on this list. I mean, how could it not? It's Borderlands 2. It really is the pinnacle of the entire series, and low-key it feels like every game since has just been trying to chase Borderlands 2. And while I think most Borderlands games are quite good, they've just never been able to top Borderlands 2. And why is that? Well, let me try to explain it. I remember when the game was about to come out, it was actually very hype. People were extremely excited. I was as well. I was ready for them to really push the series forward. It was going to become a series, which was already a big deal. I was really excited, and it did not disappoint. The game takes place after the first one, on the planet Pandora still, and it follows a new group of vault hunters who ally with the Crimson Raiders to defeat Handsome Jack, the new president of Hyperion, before he can get all the power from this new vault that apparently has unlimited power or whatever. The story is actually very good in this game. Outside of Tales from the Borderlands, it is the best story of the series, and is immediately way more compelling than anything the first game had. There's a lot more world building. They flesh out Pandora, its characters, and its antagonist. Speaking of the antagonist, Handsome Jack is easily not only the best character of the Borderlands series, but one of the best antagonists of any video game. He's just this douchebag that you really come to hate. He's just such a prick, and you're just like, man, fuck this guy, fuck everything he does. And again, one of the best antagonists ever. He makes this game story as good as it is. The writing is actually pretty good in this game as well. It's not, a masterpiece. It's not Tales from the Borderlands, but it is very good, and it's actually engaging, compelling, and still somewhat serious. There are plenty of laughs and goofy moments, but it doesn't go out of control like Borderlands 3, and I think it's just a really nice balance. All the characters from Borderlands 1 return, and they're so much more compelling and interesting, and I'm like, dang, I wish these Vault Hunters were this interesting when we were playing as them. But regardless, I like everything surrounding the story. When it comes to the gameplay though, oh yeah, it's pretty much the undisputed king. The structure of the game isn't all that different from Borderlands 1, where you're dropped into these relatively open environments, you talk to somebody or the bounty board, and you get quests and you go do them. Along the way, there's tons of monsters and assholes ready to kill you. There's a ton of loot to collect and places to see. I'll immediately say that this game's pacing is significantly better than the first ones. It starts off a lot more interesting and gets better and better the more you play it, especially in New Game Plus. And that probably is partly thanks to the narrative actually being, pretty good and engaging. Like the first game, the entire game is playable in 4-player co-op. You choose one of many classes at the beginning, and they're all incredibly different from each other. Like genuinely, all of the classes play incredibly different, and they can all have different builds themselves. There's a good amount of customization here, way more than the first game, and you get your ability a lot sooner, so none of the characters feel super similar to each other. I like the level of customization, and I've replayed this game multiple times because of just how different my build could actually be. But on top of that, the core gameplay loop is actually really solid. Going and getting the quests, killing everything, exploring these maps, it's actually really good. The level design isn't crazy or innovative or anything you haven't seen before, but it's actually good. The levels are pretty compact, easy to navigate, and it feels like there's something in every corner, unlike Borderlands 3 where it's just way too big, or Borderlands 1 where it's just flat and empty. There's actually stuff here. Sure, not every area is a winner, but a majority of the level design is pretty solid, and it keeps things going at a good pace. I also think the quests you get are much better than the first games. They're a lot more varied. They have some objective to them. It's not the most basic cookie cutter quest you've seen in a video game. There's actually some memorable ones here. There's a lot of memorable ones here. There's a lot of funny ones here as well, like Shoot Me in the Face and the side mission where Jack asks you to just kill yourself and he'll give you the bounty. There's a lot of good side missions here. You'll want to do like all of them, and of course as you do them and kill enemies, you'll level up, you'll get skill points, you can customize your build, but most importantly you get loot. You get a lot of loot in this game, and I think the loot is actually pretty solid. It doesn't go absolutely nuts like the third game, but I think the way they give you the loot is really solid, and it's incredibly rewarding and satisfying when you start getting some good shit, and then you get to use it in combat. The combat is pretty solid in this game. I will say I think Borderlands 3 and Wonderlands do have better combat, but that's not to say the combat is bad in this game. It's better than the first game, and I think it's still very playable and good nowadays. The guns are satisfying. There's a ton of different weapons. Seriously, there are so many different weapons to use and variants for each weapon. You won't find the same gun twice. There's grenades, there's a bunch of other equipment to really just give the combat variety. The AI isn't dumb as shit either. They can actually mess you up, and they can just totally tear through your shield, but you can also really mess them up as well. You get some powerful ass weapons in this game, and every time I play this game, man, the shooting still feels pretty good with some of these weapons. Some of them. On top of this, they added the badass rank system, which is basically a bunch of challenges, and this adds even more to the game. The game's also got a pretty good length to it. This is like the longest of the Borderlands games, clocking in around 30 hours, maybe 40 if you want to do all the side content, but it very much is worth it. It has solid pacing and stays engaging throughout. You can even play through the game single player. I think it's that engaging. I don't think you're going to be bored like you were with the first game. I really just enjoy this game. I think the gameplay loop is the strongest of the entire series, thanks to good level design, decent loot drops, satisfying weapons, interesting quests, and then just an engaging storyline throughout. And I feel like while other Borderlands games have been good, they just haven't been able to capture that magic that is Borderlands 2, that like almost perfect storm that made this game. The presentation's also great, way better than the first game. They really lean into the comic cel-shaded art style, and I think it looks really good. The voice acting's great, the game ran super smooth, and there's really nothing to complain about with the presentation. The game also has a bunch of DLC, but it has a bunch of good DLC. All of the DLCs are really good, especially the Tiny Tina DLC, which yeah, it became its own standalone game. It was so good. The DLC rules for this game. And I think if you're going to play this game at all these days, you absolutely should play the DLC. It is very worth it, and it is incredibly entertaining. You also get some of the best weapons of the entire game in there, but the DLC rules. And really the same thing could be said about the entire game. Borderlands 2 is one of the best first-person shooters of the last like 15 years, and I think out of all the first-person shooter RPG hybrids, it very well might be the best. This or like Fallout New Vegas. Regardless, it's one of the best hybrids, and I absolutely think the game is worth your time. It's pretty cheap nowadays. Again, it does take a good amount of time, but it is so worth it, and you'll immediately see why so many people fell in love with the Borderlands series. Like, it really doesn't take a genius here, and it's kind of crazy how 10 plus years later, Borderlands 2 still is like the peak of the entire series. I knew it was good then, but looking back, I'm just like, damn. I really didn't realize how good I had it. But at the end of the day, almost every Borderlands game is good, and I could recommend almost all of them, and that's how I'm ending this video. Borderlands is a pretty good series. I hope you all enjoyed it. Hope it was what you were looking for. Subscribe if you want to see more rankings. I'm sure Borderlands 4 will come out in the future, and I'll probably talk about it. Maybe it'll be the best of the whole series. We will see. Our secret code word for today is going to be Claptrap. Yes, everyone's favorite mascot. Okay, now we hate that fucking robot these days, but comment Claptrap if you made it to this part of the video. You will get a heart from me. It's the secret code word. Bye-bye now. Have a good Christmas, everyone.